Okay, so here's the first truth about language and communication development. And that is that language and communication development is closely related to and interdependent with other aspects of child development, cognitive development, social, emotional, and specifically emotional regulatory development, which has been discussed and I will bring back into the discussion, as well as motor development. So here's a little bit of a contrast. I'm going to mention coming up that from a behavioral standpoint, and I'm talking about learning theory, Skinnerian psychology, one of the most popular approaches in ABA now is called verbal behavior, which is based upon Skinnerian principles of learning. And one of the basic elements of that approach is that language is just a behavior. Okay. As a matter of fact, I always like to share that Skinner, who is considered to be a god by many people who support the ABA verbal behavior approach, in his retirement speech, the American Psychological Association actually admonished psychologists for even studying emotional development or cognitive development or relationship development in children and in caregivers as well, saying that that's not science. Okay. Science is only what you can observe. And one of the incredible things we're learning with Gestalt language processing is what you may hear is the surface manifestation of how a child thinks and how a child intends to communicate. So we have to embrace the fact that language and communication development requires looking into a child's learning style, learning pattern, which we're going to get into in greater depth in just a few minutes. And this leads to the very basic assumption that individual differences in language development are the rule rather than the exception. So if you look at a lot of programs that are geared towards teaching language that are steeped in a learning theory or behavioral orientation, it's always the same sequence, is that all children need to be plugged into this training program. As a matter of fact, some important proponents of this approach have actually challenged the notion that there are different learning styles and different profiles of learning strengths across different children. And that leads to a one size fits all approach, which we know does not work. And certainly what's happening in Gestalt language processing is proving that. Okay, so the claim that all children follow the same path in language development is factually incorrect. And of course, we are going to take a dip back to Ann Peters, as well as some of our early work, which demonstrates that it is incorrect. But not only that, even researchers having nothing to do, and Ann Peters falls into this category, whose research has nothing to do with children who learn language differently, children who are challenged in acquiring a symbolic system that we refer to as language and language development. So it's important to understand this has been pointed out very early in development in some of the seminal research on child language development. Truth number 3, human communication is collaborative. When we have a conversation or we exchange information through symbols, it's co-constructed. We take into account what another person knows. We build upon what another person says. And of course, that's vital with Gestalt language processing. If there are utterances maybe that cannot be taken literally, we need to try to understand that child's experience and where those utterances are coming from. One of the beautiful aspects of Lisa's presentation and hearing Barney, her son, is he's telling us where those utterances came from. He's informing us. So that makes communication more effective if we play detective and we know where the language that a child produces is coming from. And I'll show you some examples from my personal experiences as well. Human communication is multimodal. So even though I'm not going to do a deep dive into my doctoral dissertation, believe it or not, which was finished in 1978 on immediate echolalia, It was as important on video analysis for me to analyze a child's gestures and a child's body language as it was for me to analyze that child's speech. In that case, it was immediate echolalia, and then we did a study on delayed echolalia or Gestalt language forms. But we needed to look at, what is the child attending to? Is the child shifting gaze? Okay. Is the child not looking at us at all and speaking only to him or herself? So all communication is multimodal, and we need to go just beyond the words to understand a child's intentions and to understand whether it is language may be used for cognitive purposes, such as rehearsal, such as self-regulatory purposes, or whether it's language that is used for interaction to express intentions to other people. And then finally, human communication is once again, I'm being a little bit redundant here, but unless we see communication as a partnership, then we're not going to fully understand that we, especially those of us who are neurotypical support people, have a great responsibility in supporting the success of another person. And that other person also has responsibility in clarifying their message, in repairing breakdowns, in persisting in communication until communicative success is achieved. The reason I'm emphasizing this in particular is that I've been doing a lot of work recently around non-speakers and non-speakers who were thought of as significantly intellectually disabled or non-communicative. And one of the criticisms of the validity of non-speakers' communication is that, oh, well, they're not doing it totally independently. Well, all communication is collaborative. All communication is interdependent. And I believe that is so much the case with Gestalt language processing and processors, that we have to enter into that relationship with the child and work with them to make sure communication is more effective. And a little bit later in my presentation, I will present and also reiterate some points that have been made during the conference about how we engage as partners in that collaboration. And let me just mention, in the general child development literature, there's this concept of responsive caregiving. And the concept of responsive caregiving helps to explain why children in very different cultures with very different caregiving practices still can grow up to be emotionally healthy children, okay? And developmentally healthy children. So the example I remember when I used to teach courses on multicultural communication is, well, why is it that a child who spends hours on a cradle board on the back of a mom in an agricultural society, let's say in Africa, it can develop healthfully, be emotionally grounded, and develop good relationships as much as a child who develops in a Western culture, being exposed to books, being exposed to all the technology that we have right now. And what is the answer? The answer is responsive caregiving. Caregivers, and of course, for populations that need extra support, it's not just caregivers or carers, as you folks say, but it is also therapists and educators. When we are highly responsive, that best supports all development, and especially communication and language development. So once we hear strategies such as, oh, that child is just producing silly talk, so ignore that child when he's producing scripts. That is the opposite of responsive caregiving. That's actually saying, the message I'm going to give to you when you are trying to communicate to me is, it's not credible. And not only can that lead to more shutdown, but that could lead to depression. That could also lead, as we're learning from many autistic self-advocates, that could be traumatizing. If you're having difficulty communicating and you're trying your best to communicate through the way you feel is the best way for you to communicate, and you are ignored, that's a double trauma. the difficulty you're having in the first place, and not being validated and listened to and heard. And by the way, that is one of the seminal characteristics of good trauma-informed work. And that is feeling that you are heard, that people get you, that people understand or try to understand your experience. Okay, so the claim that, and let me put that back for a second, the claim that communication has to be independent or all kids follow the same path. It's based upon debunked and illogical behavioral models, especially Skinnerian models, and then Lovaas, the father of ABA, the Norwegian psychologist who came to the US. A lot of those issues, if you follow the most informed and credible research on language development, those theories were debunked in my lifetime, in my career. I was in the middle, being exposed to and learning from the revolution, what was called the social pragmatic revolution of the 70s and 80s. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And you might say, okay, well, then where do we go? One of my mentors, a retired psychologist named Arnold Samaroff, developed what was called the transactional model of child and human development, which was picked up by people in speech and language. Lee Snyder McLean, who actually was a special educator, her husband, Jim McLean, who's a speech language pathologist. They published a book in the late 80s called The Transactional Model of Language Development, saying there's a partnership going on here, that we have to understand also a child's social and cognitive, and more recently, emotional and emotional regulatory development to fully embrace a deep understanding of language and communication. And of course, for those of you familiar with the CERTS model, and there's been a lot of CERTS trainings going on in the UK, in particular by my colleagues and Emily Rubin, Amy Laurent. Emily Rubin was a student of mine many years ago, doing fantastic work in terms of not only spreading CERTS, which stands for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. If you look at some of Amy Laurent's most recent work on autism level up with her partner, or her autistic partner, it's incredible work on energy regulation and emotional regulation, and definitely pertains to some of the discussions, especially Lisa's discussion yesterday about the relationship between emotional regulatory development, neurological development, and GLP. So transactional models are supported by the successes of Gestalt language learners, that if we change the way we respond to and support Gestalt language learners, then we see children who are more motivated, children who are more engaged, if you want to be specific, children who will engage in conversational turns for more turns, who will seek you out because they know you are hearing them. Even if a child says a phrase that maybe cannot be taken literally, you are working with them to help them move to more conventional ways to express those intentions. And finally, and I've kind of alluded to this already, communication and language development is the gateway to healthy relationships, mental health and emotional well-being, and quality of life. So let me tell you a little bit about my history, which you may not know. After I had my first job in a speech and language department at a university, about 5 years later, I was offered this great opportunity to develop what was the very first communication and speech and language department in a children's psychiatric hospital. It was in the Brown University Medical School. I was there for close to 10 years, expanding the staff from 2 speech and language pathologists to 7, where we were working with kids both inpatient as well as in day programs who were referred primarily for emotional and behavioral disorders. And we published a number of articles and studies about the relationship between emotional behavioral disorders and communication and language disabilities, even outside of autism. A lot of our publications were not focused on autism at that time. And what we know now, and especially with the burgeoning literature on trauma, and I'll be referring to that a little bit, is that communication and language and the ability to express yourself is the best inoculation against PTSD, trauma, and therefore the best support for having emotional well-being and mental health being supported in your life, which underlies so much of what we define as quality of life. So we're talking about quality of life. It's not that much of a huge leap from talking about really acknowledging and understanding Gestalt language processing and help Gestalt language processors to communicate more effectively and how they feel in life about relationships and about their own confidence in establishing their sense of personhood and self. So important. Okay, so we're going to take a little shift now. And this is to talking about the neurodiversity movement, which is a game changer. And by the way, this is a nice photo. My wife and I are lucky enough to have a little cottage down by a pond on the Rhode Island coast. I live on the East Coast, very close to the ocean. And this is the 4th of July with the fireworks going on our pond. And I think of the neurodiversity movement in that way. It's exciting. It still is exciting. It's opening up new possibilities, and it is grabbing the attention not only of practitioners, but it's grabbing the attention of the mainstream public because it's about understanding all of us that we each have a different brain, which means, and I'll get into this more specifically, that we see the world in different ways. So, a little bit of history for those of you who are not familiar with this. The term neurodiversity was introduced by Judy Singer. I had the chance to meet Judy a few years ago on a panel in Sydney, Australia. She is an autistic sociologist, and this was her master's thesis. And this is a book that was based upon Judy's master's thesis. And Steve Silberman, who I'll talk about in a minute, who's the author of a seminal work, and unfortunately, I'll say this right up front, Steve became a good friend of mine, and we met regularly, even though we're 3,000 miles away, we were, and he passed away about a month ago, unfortunately and unexpectedly. And he's being held up as an icon in the world of neurodiversity, and he earned every bit of that, every bit of that. So there's a quote from Steve. Few people, let me just move that out of the way of my slides block, can claim to have coined a term that changed the world for the better. And Judy Singer can. Okay. I do want to point out that being a student of cognitive development going way, way back, also being based in Boston for a number of years at Emerson College, I got to know Howard Gardner. So if you're familiar with the theory of multiple intelligences, Howard Gardner is the person, the Harvard-based cognitive psychologist who's still very active, who said, you know, people learn differently. We have different strengths. We have different, therefore, if you will, needs in how we learn. And a famous quote from Howard Gardner is that it's not how smart you are that matters. What really counts is how you are smart. So we can't do a deep dive into multiple intelligence right now, but he indicated that initially there were 6 intelligences. It's been expanded to 8. Everything from linguistic intelligence to interpersonal, bodily kinesthetic, logical, mathematical, musical, naturalist intelligence, intrapersonal, and visual spatial intelligence. You could map, since I know many of you have been talking specifically about autistic individuals, you could map an autistic individual's strengths as well as areas of relative weakness on multiple intelligences. So we know not all, but many, many autistic individuals have relative strengths in visual spatial intelligence. Might have some more weaknesses in interpersonal intelligence. Some might be very, very good, very coordinated in bodily kinesthetic intelligence, but we also know that many autistic people have major issues in motor sequencing, motor planning, body awareness. By the way, that's an old myth that has gone by the wayside many years ago, that autistic people are very, very well coordinated and don't have those issues. And now we're finally acknowledging, for example, of how many autistic individuals have motor speech issues, have patterns that seem to be patterns of apraxia, more global apraxias, as well as more specifically speech and verbal apraxias. Musical intelligence. I have a number of both friends as well as kids who I've seen develop who are on the autism spectrum who are incredibly talented in music, almost to the level of savant skills. And a number of these people are making their careers in music right now. We've interviewed some musicians on Uniquely Human, the podcast, individuals who are autistic who say music comes to me like breathing. It is not an issue. It's not anything I needed to learn. Music was always within me. Again, logical mathematical intelligence. Dare I, talk about how many individuals on the spectrum have patterns that seem to be patterns of engineering brains, if you will, and seeing that in families. So much of this really does relate to the neurodiversity movement before the term neurodiversity was ever coined. Okay. When neurodiversity was coined initially, it was thought of as explaining mostly clinical diagnosed categories. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but neurodivergent conditions were thought of, okay, well, there's a relationship, across and between these conditions. And so let's talk about the brain differences. All right. And what did come out of that is, so many of people with labeled conditions now could also or should be seen as having relative strengths as well. So neurodiversity helped to explain, okay, well, there seem to be some relationships if you look at how human brains function, which we do result in challenges, but also many, many people with such conditions are now talking about the fact that, but I have strengths due to my different brain functioning. And that's where we are right now. And that's an important, you know, underwritten theme in this whole conference on GLPs. And of course, we used to think of so many of these conditions as mutually exclusive, and now we know there are high levels of co-occurrence. So with autism and ADHD for sure, dyscalculia and autism, that was discussed by Lisa. So many of these co-occurring conditions indicate that the brain is very, very complex, okay? And it's not just you have one condition and that defines either all your challenges or your relative strengths. So getting back to Steve Silberman, Steve's book, Neurotribes, and the subtitle is The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. It came out in 2015, international bestseller. It won a prestigious award from the UK, the Samuel Johnson Prize, which is an award given to literally the best nonfiction book published that year. And coincidentally, my book, Uniquely Human, and this is the second updated edition. The first edition came out within a few weeks of Steve's edition of Neurotribes. And I'm only giving you this history because as soon as the books came out, some reputable publications such as Nature Magazine, Chicago Tribune, they did reviews of the books as companion volumes. And they said, okay, and Steve said this, that Neurotribes is about the history of autism well before there was even the term autism. If you look at what's called kind of historical diagnoses, where you look at very, very accomplished people such as Tesla, Einstein, and so forth, and you look back at those individuals, wait a second, you know, autism was always here, all right? And we have to understand that. And then Steve's book said, okay, well, where does this take us in the future? Whereas my book is a storybook, and Steve's book, by the way, is a storybook, and everybody should read Neurotribes. It's a page turner, even though it's written by a science writer. Steve said, I am not an autism expert. I am a science writer. Very humble in that way, even though so many people see him as an autism expert or saw him that way. So Steve said, through the stories that I share on Uniquely Human, it's like, okay, what do we do about this? How do we understand people on the spectrum, and how does that lead to supporting children, adults, and families? And if you've not read Uniquely Human, there's a whole chapter on echolalia and Gestalt language processing, which kind of looks at, those patterns of language and language development through a uniquely human lens. So a lot of what I'm saying is not to shamelessly promote my book and our podcast, but to say that what I'm going to be talking about the rest of the time is very much grounded in our philosophy, in our practices in Uniquely Human, as well as our educational model, the CERTS model. Okay, so let's see what the neurodivergent community says. So this is a definition of neurodiversity by Samantha Kraft, who is on the spectrum. And that neurodiversity refers specifically to natural variations of human brains that result in a way that a person thinks and processes information, perceives, behaves and reacts, copes, and I added, communicates and moves and emotes, both in terms of expressing emotions as well as responding to challenges in emotional regulation, which could be physiological challenges as well. John Elder Robison, a very important autistic individual who wrote the book Look Me in the Eye, which was a bestseller for many, many years. He said neurodiversity recognizes a reality that's been a part of humanity for all time, and that is neurological diversity. And again, I don't want to, you know, be too redundant, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about Gestalt language processors. And a man named Alex Kimmel, who's on the spectrum, and he refers to himself as the self-determinator. He says that neurodiversity is the acceptance and celebration of those that operate other than what most of the world considers to be normal, and to help society to realize that no one really has the right to name what someone else's normal should be. So the beauty of the work in Gestalt language processing that's really been expanded greatly by Marge and by Alex is we are talking about a different form of language development. Now, what happened historically, and I'll be getting to this in greater detail in just a few moments, is that the whole notion of Gestalt language, of echolalia in general, was pathologized. In other words, that's not normal, okay? And what happens if you say that's not normal, that's pathology? That is a symptom, a negative symptom of autism that we need to get rid of. Then all of a sudden you have all of these studies and all of these procedures to, in some cases, going way back, punish a child's production of Gestalt language forms and immediate echolalia. And there's research, literally, where parents are told to say to their kids, no silly talk, no, or ignore it, planned ignoring, okay? Which can be a punishment in and of itself. And that is because some people who knew very little about language and communication development decided what normal should be. And that normal should be just analytic language development, even though if you look at some of the early language programs put forth by the early people in ABA, it showed no understanding of language development. How do you build language? How do you build words? By starting with sounds and having a child imitate sounds and then combine those sounds into words and then train the child to say a word when a particular stimulus is held up, like a picture or an object. That is not what language and communication is. It's teaching the facade of speech, basically. So yeah, many people were able to teach kids to say these long memorized sentences when given the right stimulus, but what did we see? It was never initiated. It was never used with communicative intent. It basically was, and I hesitate saying this, it's been said by many people, but almost like a dog trick, okay? I hold up this picture and you respond, and I reinforce you, okay? That is not based in intentional, self-generated, self-motivated communication that helps a child express their sense of self and their desires and their concerns to other people.